Welcome back to the Truth Channel. We are currently reading The Crucifixion and Death of Jesus Christ by Kelli Ritter. This is such a good book. We are in the chapter, How was the man on the Shroud of Turin crucified? Let's continue in that chapter. We are in the middle of the chapter, and let's begin. The unique reddish blood stains on the archaeological cloth known as the Shroud of Turin caught the attention of several scholars who proposed different hypotheses to explain the unusual blood color. To date, just a few hypotheses have been tested experimentally, and the results are debatable. In this paper, we test the strength of two hypotheses, namely the presence of carboxyhemoglobin, and the long-term influence of ultraviolet light on high bilirubin blood by the spectral reflectance of the blood-stained regions on the shroud, and by the color analysis of the ultraviolet irradiated high bilirubin blood stains are on the linen. The relevance of these simple methods to study the stained textiles is discussed. An investigation into the arm and the body position required to obtain the blood pattern visible in the images of the Shroud of Turin was performed using a volunteer. The two shot the rivulets on the back of the left hand of the shroud are only consistent with a standing subject with arms at an angle of 45 degrees. This angle is different from that's necessary for the forearm stains, which require nearly vertical arm standing subject. The BPA of blood visible on the frontal side of the chest, the lance wound, shows that the shroud represents the bleeding in a realistic manner for a standing position, while the stains at the back of a supposed post-mortem bleeding from the same wound for a supine corpse are totally unrealistic. Simulation of the bleeding from the nail wounds contacting wood surfaces yielded unclear results. The Shroud of Turin, hereafter the Shroud, is one of the most widely known and widely studied artifacts in human history, with enormous historical and religious significance. For years, the Shroud has inspired worldwide interest in its images on its fabric, which appear to be the body and face of a man executed in a manner consistent with crucifixion. And many believe that these images were formed in the shroud fibers during the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But more recently, other reports have suggested that the shroud also contains evidence of inscriptions, and these reports have been used to add critical support to the view that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus. Unfortunately, these reports of inscriptions are based on marks that are barely visible on the shroud. Even when the images are enhanced, and the actual existence of writing on the shroud is still a matter of considerable debate. Here we discuss the previous evidence concerning the psychological processes involved generally in the perception of writing, and especially when letters and words are indistinct. We report two experiments in which the influence of religious context on a perception of inscriptions was addressed, specifically using an image of woven fabric, modern linen, containing no writing with no religious preference. The image was viewed into different contexts. In the religious context, participants informed that the image was a linen that was an artifact important to the Christian faith, whereas in the non-religious neural context, participants were informed that the image was a simple piece of linen. Both groups were told that the image may contain faint words and are asked to report any words they could see. All participants detected words on the image and indicated that these words were visible and were able to trace the image on the words they detected. In each experiment, more religious contexts were detected in the religious context condition that in the neural context condition, whereas the two contexts showed no effect on the number of non-religious words detected, indicating that the religious context had a specific effect on the perception of illusory or writing. Indeed, the neural context condition, no religious words at all were reported in either experiment. These findings suggest that the images of woven material like linen inspire illusory perceptions of writing, and that the nature of these perceptions is influenced considerably by the religious expectations of observers. As a consequence, the normal psychological processes underlying the perception of writing and the tendency of these processes to produce illusory perceptions should be an essential consideration when addressing the existence of religious inscriptions on religious artifacts such as the Shroud of Turin. The act of putting to death by nailing or binding to a cross. Among the modes of capital punishment known to the Jewish penal law, crucifixion is not found. The hanging of criminals on a tree, mentioned in Deuteronomy 22, was resorted in the New Testament only after lapidation. A Jewish court could not have passed a sentence of death by crucifixion without violating Jewish law. The Roman Penal Code recognized this cruel penalty from the remote times. It may have developed out of the primitive custom of hanging on the arbor inflex, which was dedicated to the gods of the netherworld. Seneca still calls the cross inflex lignum. Trees were often used for crucifying convicts. Originally, only slaves were crucified, hence death on a cross and supplicum servile were used indiscriminately. Later, provincial freedom and obscure station were added to these class liable to the sentences. Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixion under all circumstances. The following crimes entailed this penalty: piracy, highway robbery, assassination, forgery, false testimony, mutiny, high treason, rebellion, and soldiers that deserted the enemy, and slaves who denounced their masters. Modes of execution. The crosses used were of different shapes. Some were in the form of others that of St. Andrew's cross, while others again were in 4 parts. The more common kind considered of a stake firmly embedded in the ground before the condemned arrived at the place of execution, and a crossbeam bearing the titulus, the inscription naming the crime and the person's name. It was this crossbeam, not a heavy stake, which the condemned was compelled to carry to the scene of execution. The cross was not very high, and the sentenced man could without difficulty be drawn up with ropes. His hands and feet were fastened with the nails to the crossbeam and stake. Though it has been held that, as in Egypt, the hands and feet were merely bound with ropes, the execution was always preceded by flagellation, and on his way to his doom, led through the most populous streets, the delinquent was exposed to insult and injury. Upon arrival at the stake, his clothes were removed and execution took place. Death was probably caused by the starvation or exhaustion, the cramped position of the body, causing fearful tortures, and ultimately gradual paralysis. Whether a footrest was provided is to open doubt, but usually the body was placed as astride a board. The agony lasted at least 12 hours, in some cases as long as 3 days. To hasten death, the legs were broken, and this was considered an act of clemency. The body remained on the cross, food for birds, or a prey until it rotted, or cast before wild beasts. Special permissions to remove the body was occasionally granted. Officers and soldiers were in charge. This is a deep topic, and we're not even done with the chapter yet, so let's end this podcast, and we'll continue in the next episode. Oh, excuse me. Thank you.